Welcome, Sean here, April 16th, 2024, and today I wanted to attempt my first read aloud, just to share some ideas that I've been thinking about and exploring. We're here in my parlor room. As you can see, it's a little quieter, so hopefully my voice comes across not too raspy or annoying to listen to. Thanks for being with me. Wanted to start by setting the mood with a little dragon's blood incense. And to keep things with a high vibration, we're going to go ahead and ring the bell. As I continue to explore the impact that objects can have and artifacts imprinting on our consciousness and our memories, both individually and collectively, I've been exploring what sound might also do to our brains and our emotions and our general understanding of time and space. So I like this bell. So I wanted to open with a short excerpt from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, as he is cited as the philosophical underpinnings of this document here called the World Economic Forum, committed to improving the state of the world, and it's sort of a overview of all of their collective projects from 1972 to 2020. It's a 190-page white paper, so we won't go into a lot of details. I'm just going to read the opening passage from Goethe here. Until one is committed, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffective, concerning all acts of initiative and creation. There is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans. That the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents and meetings and material assistance which no man could have dreamed would have come his way. Whatever you can do or dream, you can begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Begin it now. So Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, one of the preeminent German philosophers of the Enlightenment era, seems to come up from time to time in my work and research, and I just find that passage important to share. A lot of people are discussing the World Economic Forum and all of the various doings that that group is up to, but I found the opening of that white paper with Goethe's philosophy to be significant, especially in light of the book I'm reading right now. This is a book that was recommended by Dr. Mihaela Ulieru in her interview with John C. Rogers on the Mindplex podcast, which I highly recommend listening to that in full. So Dr. Mihaela, if you're out there, thank you for the recommendation for The One, which is by Heinrich Päs, and it discusses how an ancient idea holds the future of physics. So I've been taking a lot of notes, and there's just a lot of good stuff in this book, so I highly recommend picking up a copy and reading through it if you're at all interested in where quantum mechanics intersects with ancient philosophy. And we're going to read about 10 pages, so hopefully you find it interesting. We're going to begin on page 165 with a clockwork universe, powered by the pipes of Pan. Isaac Newton is usually considered the herald of modernity and chief architect of the modern world, as his biographer James Gleick describes him. In his magnum opus, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, credited as one of the most important works in the history of science, Newton derived Kepler's laws of planetary motion, developed his law of universal gravitation, and established the bedrock of classical mechanics so exhaustively that the discipline is often simply referred to as Newtonian mechanics, a system of the world that is so rational and deterministic that it is customarily compared to clockwork. Through Newton, according to cosmologist Hermann Bondi, the landscape has been so totally changed, the ways of thinking have been so deeply affected, that it is very hard to get hold of what it was like before. When the English romanticist William Wordsworth portrayed Newton as an ultra-rational, dispassionate loner, with his prism and silent face, the marble index of a mind forever voyaging through strange seas of thought alone, this, in fact, describes fittingly the small but ambitious, lonely farm boy who observed attentively the shadows moving along the walls of his grandparents' house, and then finally hammered wooden pegs into the stonework to construct a sundial, and measure the time from the cycles of the sun. There was another side to Newton, though, a Newton who was not the first of the age of reason, as economist John Maynard Keynes has pointed out, but the last of the magicians. A Newton who dabbled in biblical exegesis and alchemy, and who, according to historians of science James Maguire and Pio Ratansi, pursued these endeavors in as rigorous a fashion as his scientific work. Both of these seemingly conflicting traits can be traced back to a deeply rooted monistic conviction. As Maguire and Ratansi have pointed out, Newton had composed extensive notes on an ancient monistic underpinning of his physics that he planned to include in the revised version of his Principia. The sheer bulk of the manuscripts, the number of copies and variants, the relation to Newton's other writings, and the testimony of Newton's associates all make it certain that he considered the arguments and conclusions an important part of his philosophy. A crucial source of inspiration for this background was Newton's older colleague at the University of Cambridge, Ralph Cudworth. In England, the Renaissance Platonism had originally manifested itself prominently in poetry. In the footsteps of Florentine poet Girolamo Benevieni, a member of Ficino's Academy, who had composed a poetic interpretation of Ficino's interpretation of Platonic love, describing how love from its celestial source flows to the world of sense, moves the heavens, refines the soul, gives laws, and from that soul is earthly Venus born, whose beauty lights the skies and habits earth, is nature's veil. These ideas become a powerful influence on love lyrics, first in Italy and later in England. Edmund Spenser's poems, Frau Hymns and The Fairy Queen, in which nature is personified by a woman with a veil, for example, exhibit a distinctly Platonic flavor, as does his friend Philip Sidney's Astrophile and Stella, which influenced William Shakespeare. Sidney also was a close friend of Giordano Bruno's during his stay in England, where Bruno used Ficino's books in his lectures. In the 17th century, these traditions inspired a group of philosophers who became known as the Cambridge Platonists. A prominent member of this group was Ralph Cudworth, who was deeply worried about the increasing popularity of what he perceived as materialism and atheism, including most notably Spinoza's monism. In his magnum opus, The True Intellectual System of the Universe, from 1678, Cudworth thus developed his own version of monism to refute these philosophical trends. In an ironic twist of history, Cudworth's work was later confused with the philosophy of Spinoza, which he was trying to refute with a somewhat odd argument. Based on Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, Cudworth argued that all belief systems, including atheism and materialism, could actually be traced back to a common source, a primordial, monistic, Prisa Theologia, or Philosophia Perennis, that had once been revealed by God and shared by the ancient Egyptian religion, prophets, and sages, such as Moses, Orpheus, Pythagoras, and Plato, and had been watered down ever since. As the core concept of this philosophy, Cudworth identified the monistic en kai pan, which is Greek for one and all. Little known is that Newton strove to rediscover this distinctive monistic philosophy in both his physics and his non-scientific activities in alchemy and biblical exegesis. Newton believed that he knew how God's agency operated in his created world, as Maguire and Ratansi write. And just like the Cambridge Platonists, he was convinced he would rediscover the ancient knowledge of this Prisa Theologia. As Maguire and Ratansi proved, Newton saw the task of natural philosophy as the restoration of the knowledge of the complete system of the cosmos. Parallels to the Renaissance philosophy of Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, as well as the thought of Giordano Bruno, are obvious and striking. Indeed, Newton's notes are full of references to Plato, Pythagoras, and the music of the spheres, which he interprets as an allegory for gravity. Maguire and Ratansi determine a strongly Platonic bias in his authorities. About the various planets, elements, and phenomena that were deified in antiquity, Newton explains, "These things all are one thing, though there may be any names." In other words, one and the same divinity exercising its powers in all bodies whatsoever, as Newton approvingly explains the monistic philosophy of antiquity. Likewise, in a draft of his Optics, Newton wondered, what is it, by means of which bodies act on one another at a distance? And to what agent did the ancients attribute the gravity of their atoms? And what did they mean by calling God a harmony and comparing him in matter to the god Pan and his pipe? Pan, as Newton explains in his notes, was the supreme divinity inspiring this world with harmonic ratio like a musical instrument, and struck the harmony of the world in a playful song. As Maguire and Ratansi have pointed out to Newton, the universal gravitation that, according to his famous discovery, is responsible for both objects on Earth falling down and the celestial pull that forces the moon to orbit Earth, and that could be generalized to the planets and finally to all celestial objects whatsoever, was inseparably linked to his belief that gravity was a direct result of the exercise of divine power. This all-encompassing divine power permeated everything that is, Newton believed, and is particularly interesting parallels to the recent research aiming to derive gravity in space-time from entanglement. As Maguire and Ratansi have pointed out, there was no multiplicity of Newtons that can be characterized as either the last of the magicians or the first of the scientists. Instead, the historians of science find sufficient evidence that Newton's entire edifice of ideas is permeated by monistic philosophy. The mechanics and cosmology of the Principia were influenced by Newton's theological views and his belief in a pristine knowledge, and thus by his monistic philosophy, and these topics constituted, for him as for many of his contemporaries, the ultimate problems. We will find this pattern recurs in future scientific breakthroughs until the present day. Conspiracy in poetry. Despite how little the influence of monism on the development of science is, this process wasn't over yet with Newton and his discovery of classical mechanics. It was the romantic science of the second scientific revolution that developed concepts such as field theory that seem to lie at the heart of the challenge modern physicists face today. At the same time, though, romanticists came up with spoiled, subjective notions that eventually reinforced the association of monism with pseudoscience. Well, in the course of the 18th century, Newton's clockwork universe had been generally accepted. Where it came from was forgotten. Monistic philosophy made another detour through politics, secret societies, and poetry before it was fed back into science. In the early 1700s, the Irish philosopher John Toland, a contemporary of Newton, had added a new political twist to the speculation about a monistic primordial truth. Toland had started out as a deist, arguing that Christianity could be understood exclusively by reason, only to see his books being burned publicly in Dublin. Around the same time, in 1697, Thomas Aikenhead, the 20-year-old student at the University of Edinburgh, where Toland had achieved his master's degree, was hanged for blasphemy after he claimed that God, the world, and nature are but one thing. It must have been shocking for Toland to realize that such an act of injustice could still happen, and not in Inquisition-oppressed southern Europe, but in Presbyterian Scotland. After these incidents, Toland became increasingly radical. In his Letters to Serena, according to Toland's biographer Justin Champion, conceived as an antidote to the damage false religion and superstition did to civic communities, and addressed to Sophia Charlotte of Hanover, the latter Queen of Prussia and sister of King George I, ancestor of the British royal family. Toland was the first to coin the word pantheism, and to describe himself as a pantheist. As historian of science Margaret Jacob explains, Toland used Newton's science to argue that motion is inherent in matter, or, in other words, that nature can govern itself, that motion, life, and change have entirely naturalist explanations. Following in the footsteps of earlier monists, Toland identified the Egyptian goddess Isis as nature, the parent of all things. Toland was also involved in the circulation and probably also the composition of a dangerous clandestine text describing the monotheistic religions as fraud. Drawing on Lucretius, Bruno, Spinoza, Lucio Venani, and other heretics, Toland dismissed priests as agents of tyranny, and more than a century before Karl Marx spoke of religion as the opium of the people. Moses, Jesus, and Mohammed are depicted as impostors, false prophets who manipulated religion to their own ends. What's new is that Toland blends his monism with, in his time radical, political liberalism, and, even by today's standards, radical, anti-clericalism. Toland advocates liberty, religious tolerance, and republicanism, including full citizenship and equal rights for Jewish people, and becomes an activist for Whiggism, the liberal political philosophy that opposed the Catholic monarch and advocated the supremacy of the Parliament over the king in the aftermath of the English Revolution. Following Spinoza and Toland, monism got associated not only with heresy but increasingly also with progressive politics. In his last work, Pantheisticon, Toland developed a liturgy for pantheists that has been likened to the rituals of the increasingly popular lodges of Freemasons, and asserted that true knowledge of nature would liberate the mind from the dark shadows of superstition and consequently dissolve the grounds of political tyranny. As Justin Champion writes, indeed, it has been speculated that Toland was affiliated with an early Masonic group, and it is generally accepted now that at least some Masonic lodges, besides engaging in obscure rituals and networking, some would say wangling, by the circulation of clandestine literature, by cultivating a libertine tone, and providing safe spaces for free thinking and speech, also became powerful catalysts in spreading Enlightenment principles. Many of the early English Freemasons were French Protestant refugees and Whigs, with excellent connections to the natural philosophers of the Royal Society. Indeed, all of the secretaries of the Royal Society from 1714 to 1747 were Freemasons. A particularly famous Mason was John Theophilus Desaguliers, member of the Royal Society and experimental assistant to Isaac Newton, who wrote a poem to praise a blend of Newtonian philosophy, Masonic symbols, and Hanoverian monarchy as universal harmony. Another refugee of French origin was John Custos, who had made it back to London after he had been kidnapped, tortured, and threatened with being burned alive by the Portuguese Inquisition. Custos' book describing this misery became a bestseller and added to the appeal of Freemasonry, even though, or because of, he exaggerated both his torture and his bravery in not betraying the Masonic secrets. In the following years, Freemasonry developed into an international trend, with secrecy and the claim to be in possession of arcane truth as its trademarks. Pythagorean secrecy turned out to be a perfect match for Masonic rituals, and few philosophies would have been better suited as an integral part of Masonic mythology than the Prissa Theologia, or Philosophia Perennis, conceived of by Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and Cudworth, and searched for by Newton. So, for much of the 18th century, monism remained hidden behind the closed doors of such secret brotherhoods. That changed when at least one Masonic group in Germany turned its Enlightenment agenda into political activism. By 1780, the Bavarian Illuminati had started to successfully infiltrate government administrations with the ultimate goal of overcoming the dominion of people over people and establishing a free society. When its members engaged in espionage and document theft, the order was outlawed around 1785. Only 4 years later, the breakout of the French Revolution shocked absolutistic rulers throughout Europe, and the brief existence of the Bavarian Illuminati inspired various conspiracy theories that vilified this and other Masonic groups, and accused them of instigating revolutions and pursuing universal domination within a new world order. In this emotionally charged climate, the conservative scholar Heinrich Jacobi provoked an argument that uncovered the widespread pantheism among leading German intellectuals such as Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, Johann Gottfried Herder, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe, the polymath and literary genius who became a German national idol, has harbored pantheistic convictions from an early age. In his autobiography, he reminisced about how, as a young boy, he almost set his father's furniture on fire when he tried to mount a flame atop an altar he had assembled with a collection of natural objects, presumably leaves, feathers, fossils, and interesting-looking stones and flowers. These items should represent the world and worship of the great God of nature through his creation, the God of motion of the stars, the days and seasons, the animals and plants, as Goethe writes. Appropriately, when the young poet attended the university in Strasbourg and fell in love, he turned to nature to express his feelings. How fair doth nature appear again! How bright the sunbeams! How smiles the plain! Goethe extols. Around the same time, Goethe composed the poem Prometheus, glorifying the mythological Titan's rebellion against Zeus, a barely concealed attack against an authoritarian, monotheistic god. The inflammatory work didn't get published until 15 years later, when Goethe's friend, Heinrich Jacobi, without the author's knowledge or consent, took advantage of it in his attack against Spinozian philosophy. 5 years earlier, in 1780, Jacobi had visited his fellow Freemason, the famous writer and Enlightenment scholar Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, and showed him Goethe's poem. To Jacobi's consternation, Lessing wasn't repelled, but admitted that he himself was a pantheist. The orthodox concepts of divinity are no longer for me. I cannot enjoy them, one and all. I know nothing else. After Lessing died 1 year later, Jacobi denounced Lessing's pantheism and caused a scandal that propelled a major shift in German philosophy. Ironically, contrary to Jacobi's objective, this episode, known as the Pantheism Controversy, triggered a substantial and lasting Spinoza revival. One famous reader who came under the spell of Goethe's Prometheus was the voyager, naturalist, and later revolutionary Georg Forster, who took part as a teenager in James Cook's second circumnavigation from 1772 to 1775, a trip that imbued him with monistic spirit. I am indebted to that voyage for the development of an endowment which determined my course in life from childhood on, namely, endeavoring to trace my ideas back to a certain universality, bundling them into a unity, and thus endowing an awareness of the whole of nature. Just like his contemporaries Goethe and the young Alexander von Humboldt, who had accompanied Forster on several journeys and for whom he became a role model, Forster was convinced that everything is connected through the finest modulations, that the order of nature does not follow our divisions. Forster is also an exemplar of the link between 18th century monism and progressive politics. When the French Revolutionary Army conquered his hometown, Forster joined the revolutionaries and worked to establish the first democratic state on German territory, the short-lived Republic of Mainz. It lasted only 4 months until Mainz was recaptured by the Prussian army. Forster, who had been sent for negotiations to France, died only 1 year later in Paris, lonely and impoverished. Meanwhile, monistic philosophy was becoming increasingly popular. By the end of the 18th century, monism, now associated with arcane truths and progressive politics, had made it back into mainstream culture and became a powerful motif in the arts. References to monistic motifs can be found in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, with its invocations of the powers of the earth, the laws of nature, and nature's God, and Frederick Schiller's Ode to Joy, extolling how magic binds again, what custom had strictly divided, how at nature's breasts drink all the just, all the evil, to follow her trail of roses and dedicating this kiss to all the world. Or in the invocation of the Egyptian goddess Isis in Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's opera The Magic Flute. In fact, Egyptologist Jan Assmann diagnoses a mystery fever and a downright Egyptomania in the last quarter of the 18th century. A flood of texts about ancient mystery cults that never before or after have attracted a comparable attention. Ludwig van Beethoven, who set Schiller's Ode to Joy to music in the version that was chosen later as the anthem of Europe, kept the sentence, "I am all that is," copied from Schiller's essay, The Mission of Moses, and attributed to Isis as an embodiment of monism, in a frame on his desk until he died in 1827. For the profoundly influential Goethe, monism remains a recurring theme in his work throughout his life, from his 1784 scientific essay on granite, in which he emphasizes that all natural things are related with each other, to his poems Reunited and One and All, in which he, in the tradition of Plotinus, Eurygena, and Ficino, describes the creation of the universe as a separation from God that can be vanquished in love, and how the eternal beast stirs itself in everything, to his Xenia from 1827, in which he writes that Isis shows herself without a veil, but man has a cataract. Also, the German edition of naturalist and explorer Alexander von Humboldt's essay on the geography of plants credits Goethe's inspiration with the dedication and an engraving that shows the genius of poetry unveiling Isis. While Goethe is mainly famous for his poetry, he took a keen interest in science and also performed scientific studies himself. Independently of the French physician Felix Viazer, he discovered, for example, that human embryos possess an incisive bone, just like those of other mammals, a finding that provided the missing link between humans and animals and could be interpreted as evidence for biological evolution. It was through Goethe and the Romanticists that monism eventually got fed back into philosophy and science, and resurfaced as a major source of inspiration in the Second Scientific Revolution. Among the key figures in this process was a young prodigy who was still a teenager in the 1790s, but would go far. Henkai Pan, one and all. For Frederick Schelling and his friends, the strange-sounding, muttered words were all at once. Code word, greeting, and motto. The phrase literally meant the world. Schelling had been only 15 years old when he enrolled in the Tübingen Stift, and was 5 years younger than his roommates, the sensitive and original Frederick Holderlin, and the cumbersome, earnest, brooding Gottfried Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who was already in his youth was known by the nickname Old Man. By then, Schelling had already taught himself 8 languages, including Hebrew and Arabic. While all 3 of them were highly gifted and all of them were to become famous, none of them was to become a priest. Together, they suffered from the strict rules in this gallery of theology, as they described it in desperate letters to their parents. Yet the Stift was also considered to be the most prestigious seminary for the education of future Protestant priests in the country. There, exactly 200 years before, Johannes Kepler had been educated. Dreaming up to the skies, Holderlin had composed a poem to celebrate the man who had made sense out of the planetary orbits around the sun, interpreted them as a cosmic harmony, and inspired Newton's classical mechanics. In starry regions, my mind perambulates, hovers over Uranian fields and ponders, solitary and daring in my course, demanding a brazen stride. Who led the thinker in Albion into the field of deeper contemplation, and who, lighting the way, ventured into the labyrinth? Like many young minds of their generation, the 3 friends felt restless. The lack of individuality and freedom in the Stift only reflected the political state of affairs outside. In this situation, their slogan evoked a secret paradise, and in the earth-shaking years following 1789, there was good reasons for secrecy. Sure, Tübingen was a quiet, small town with half-timbered houses and a medieval castle in its center, overlooking lush green hills and the outskirts of Swabian Jura. But Tübingen was only 70 miles from Strasbourg and the French border, a distance a fast horse could travel in a few hours from the country where the French Revolution was powdering Europe's feudal order into pieces. When the friends joined a group of students to plant a liberty pole on a meadow outside the town and signed a pamphlet with revolutionary slogans such as Vive la Liberté, the Duke of Württemberg, Karl Eugen, came in person to the stiff to investigate the case. To the friends' relief, the only consequence was that the group's leader had to escape to Strasbourg. Meanwhile, the three friends' curiosity wasn't confined to politics. They corporately sacrificed Bacchus and joined for heavy drinking, and they began to get up in the middle of the night, 2 hours before the daily curriculum started, to discuss philosophy. In hindsight, these discussions were just as revolutionary as the politics. In 1781, Immanuel Kant had published his Critique of Pure Reason, in which he had pointed out the impossibility of accessing reality as it really is. For Kant, the thing in itself, the unconditioned absolute, remained elusive. Instead, we always experience reality indirectly through our senses. Space and time, for example, were described by Kant as a pair of glasses through which we perceive the world. Johann Fichte had taken this view to the extreme by advocating that it is the subject who creates reality, a conception that comes close to John Wheeler's participatory universe, illustrated in his enigmatic You 200 years later. As it turned out, such a view fit snugly with the upcoming intellectual movement of Romanticism, which placed the creative ego up front. Romanticism represented a rebellion of the individual against many things, against the state and society where everything was decided by nobility, kings, and queens, against a paradigm of nature working as a mechanical clockwork, against a boring and gray daily life that left no space to follow one's dreams. Sparked by the French Revolution's demand for freedom for the individual and Fichte's philosophy emphasizing the role of the individual in the emergence of our experience, Romanticism became the predominant intellectual movement in the early 19th century. The Romanticists idealized nature and arts, where they sought that what they were lacking in their daily routines. In nature, the romantic ego hoped to recover itself, but to find the ego in nature needed to have a common source. The Romanticists needed a principle to reconcile ego and universe, mind and matter, thought and desire. They were in need of Hen, of an all-embracing one, and the three friends became pivotal in supplying it. The creative Frederick Hölderlin turned to poetry and wrote hymnic appraisals of becoming one with nature. To be one with all, this is the life divine, this is man's heaven. To return in blessed self-forgetfulness, all, into the all of nature. This is the pinnacle of thoughts and joys. This is the sacred mountain peak, the place of eternal rest. Hölderlin became one of the most important poets of his time until, at only 35, he was diagnosed with incurable mental illness and spent the rest of his life in a tower by the Neckar riverbank, just a few steps away from the Tübingen Stift. Hegel and Schelling would devote the rest of their lives to striving for the true philosophy of Heine, first as comrades and later as bitter rivals. Schelling, in particular, became a fast-rising star and developed into the prime philosopher of the Romantic movement. In 1798, at the age of 23, he was hired by Goethe as a professor in Jena, the university of the liberal duchy around Weimar, known as Athens at the River Ilm. In Jena, Schiller and Fichte were already teaching until the latter was fired for atheism. Yet Schelling's monistic philosophy resonated even better with the convictions of Goethe, who himself wrote about the unity of nature in a way closely reminiscent of Hölderlin. No wonder Schelling soon became part of Goethe's inner circle and got acquainted with the poets of German Romanticism. In an unpublished poem from around this time, Schelling demanded that a true religion should exhibit itself in stones and moss, flowers, metals, and everything, so that one may immerse oneself in the universe, or in one's lover's fair eyes. Yet the lover he was referring to was married to another man. Caroline, wife of Romanticist August Schlegel, would be the love of his life. 12 years his senior, she was intelligent, highly educated, and emancipated, and had already lived an adventurous life. At the age of 36, she had, together with her husband, translated 6 of Shakespeare's plays into German, given birth to 4 children, one of them the son of a French revolutionist officer with whom she had engaged in a one-night stand during a ball. And she had been widowed and remarried. When living in the Republic of Mainz, She had been close friends with Georg Forster, who by then served as the city-state's vice president. When the Prussian troops recaptured the city, she had been imprisoned and, as a Democrat and lady of easy virtue, banned from many places, including her hometown of Göttingen. After she married Schlegel, the couple moved to Jena, where their household became a Romanticist hub. It was then that she met Schelling, whom she described as a primeval figure and compared with granite. Soon, Schelling and Carolyn began an affair that was tolerated by her husband. The years in Jena were probably the happiest in Schelling's life. With the help of Goethe, he got Carolyn to obtain a divorce and marry him, but the couple would live together for only 6 years. When Carolyn died in 1809, Schelling felt the last tie connecting him with the world was cut, and his philosophy acquired a dark note, speaking of chaos, accidents, and an irrational desire at the foundation of all things. But these times were still in the future, when in 1799 Schelling got Hegel a position in Jena, and the two old friends worked so closely together that it's sometimes hard to reconstruct who wrote what. In these years, Schelling developed his Nature Philosophy, a philosophy of nature that would shape the science of his time and the development of modern physics. To a significant degree, Schelling's philosophy reflected his conflicted personality. He was a man torn between inwardness and extroversion, between the absolute and the concrete, between spirit and nature, between religion and atheism. Throughout his life, Schelling struggled to reconcile Fichte with Spinoza, ego with the world, and an all-encompassing absolute with the diversity experienced in nature. Adopting Spinoza's monism, Schelling tried to unify matter and mind. To him, everything was godlike, from the crystal to the leaf, and from the leaf to human nature. And just as Heraclitus wrote both, "From all things one and from one all things," and "War is the father of all," Schelling's philosophy reflects the ideas of Georg Forster and circles around the principles of unity and of opposing polarities and complementing each other to form an integrated whole, man and woman, electricity and magnetism. When Niels Bohr's philosophical background is linked to German idealism, this refers to the philosophy of Kant, Fichte, Hegel, and Schelling. In fact, Bohr's principle of complementarity, the idea that contrary descriptions such as particle or wave are not contradictory but complementary, strongly resembles Schelling's opposing polarities, and Bohr's emphasis on the importance of the observer recalls the Romanticist's creative ego. But this story tells only half the truth. In contrast to Schelling, Bohr was anything but a monist. In fact, as we have seen before, it was a defining element of Bohr's philosophy to deny the entity that corresponds to the combined complements as part of reality. Thus, if Bohr really adopted the philosophy of German idealism, he strongly blended it with positivism, the view that only that which is observable is real. In contrast, according to Mihaela Ulieru, a philosopher at the University of Edinburgh, Schelling's main contribution was to naturalize Kant's notion of the unconditioned and to transform it into an object of empirical investigation for natural philosophy of nature. In doing so, Schelling took Kant's important insight about the perspectival nature of human knowledge and turned it upside down. As Schelling put it, empiricism extended to include unconditionedness is precisely philosophy of nature. Schelling thus complements the experimental investigation of nature with theoretical model building, allowing for abstract conceptions that are not directly observable but still part of reality and even more real than empirical knowledge, which always is subject to a specific perspective. In doing so, Schelling developed concepts that exhibit astonishing parallels with quantum mechanics. In his first outline of a system of the philosophy of nature, Schelling introduced dynamic atoms at the foundation of nature, which do not exist in space and cannot be viewed as part of matter, but are rather constituent factors of matter, whose effects and products are presentable in space. The dynamic atom itself is nothing other than a product itself viewed from a higher perspective. The similarity with quantum objects that describes physics before measurement in abstract Hilbert spaces is startling, 100 years before scientists even started to explore the physics of the quantum realm. As Massimi describes it, Schelling boldly relocated Kant's unconditioned in the realm of theoretical reason, in the form of scientific knowledge of nature. In addition, Schelling's monism provides a surprisingly accurate description of entanglement. And finally, in his struggle to understand how many things can originate from one, Schelling, more concretely than Goethe before him, echoed Eriugena and anticipated the basic idea of decoherence. When he explains that before humans lived in a natural state and man was one with the surrounding world, this still sounds like a vague commitment to primeval monism. But when he goes on to explain how, as soon as human sets itself apart in opposition to the outside world, he separates what nature had unified. He separates object from observer, and finally, by observing himself from himself. This boils down to an amazingly accurate description of the quantum factorization into observer, observed system, and environment, thereby giving rise to the decoherent frog perspective. Indeed, for Schelling, philosophy, or science that is, adopts a God's perspective, understanding the totality of nature as a whole. And according to his friend and collaborator Hegel, what we observe in nature is God himself, although perceived as something alien, as seen from outside instead of from within. Obviously, Schelling and Hegel shared similar thoughts with Hölderlin, who gave them a more poetic expression. But an instant of reflection hurls me down. I reflect and find myself as I was before, alone, with all the griefs of mortality, and my heart's refuge, the world in its eternal oneness, is gone. Nature closes her arms, and I stand like an alien before her, and do not understand her. Well, so it's a little more than 10 pages, so I hope you're bearing with me here. We've got just a couple more sections to go. This next one is called From Frankenstein to Fields. Schelling's career paralleled the victory march of Romanticism. He received a knighthood. The King of Prussia wooed him as the God-chosen teacher of the time to join Berlin University. Eventually, the King of Bavaria engraved "To Germany's First Thinker" on his tombstone. After all was said and done, pantheism in the clandestine region of Germany, as the poet of Heinrich Heine would declare only a few years later, and Schelling's influence would spread far and wide. After the English poets Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth visited Germany in 1798, they carried Romanticism and a monistic apprehension of nature back to Britain, where they set out to write a poem to change the world. While this poem was never accomplished, in his works, Wordsworth would speak of himself as a worshipper of nature, and of nature as the breath of God. These ideas would inspire the art of William Turner and the French Impressionists, drive Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, and Vincent van Gogh to leave their studios and paint in nature, and impel scientists to leave their laboratories. In this spirit, Alexander von Humboldt set out to ascend Chimborazo, thought to be the highest mountain on earth, trying to document and measure everything, while conceiving nature as a reflection of the whole and a net-like intricate fabric. The monistic glorification of nature would become an integral component of the frontier myth that looked at the great wilderness of the American West as a universal promise, conveyed through the works of Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Ansel Adams, Jack Kerouac, and many others. A wonderful expression of this sense of an all-encompassing nature is Whitman's poem titled with the Greek-German word cosmos, who includes diversity and is nature, the past, the future, dwelling there like space inseparable together. Finally, a monistic cosmos would become once more a driving force for science, and in England, monism-inspired physics would undergo its next revolution. When in the early 19th century, scientists had started to investigate phenomena such as electricity and magnetism, heat, fluidity, and life, the limitations of explanations within the context of Newton's classical mechanics became more and more obvious. In this situation, the Enlightenment concept of a clockwork universe appeared increasingly unsuitable. In its place came a revival of the old allegory of the universe as an organism. In this situation, Schelling's monistic philosophy became a major source of inspiration for the early pioneers in electrochemistry and electromagnetism, who had had close ties with the intellectual trend of Romanticism. Defining elements of this philosophy were the idea of unification, energy conservation, and the balance of opposing polarities complementing each other, all melded within a monistic perspective onto the universe. According to the late American philosopher of science Thomas S. Kuhn, Schelling maintained that magnetic, electrical, chemical, and finally even organic phenomena would be interwoven into one great association, which extends over the whole of nature. This had concrete implications for how the new phenomena of electricity and magnetism were approached, as Kuhn explains. Even before the discovery of the battery, Schelling insisted that without doubt only a single force in its various guises is manifest in the phenomena of light, electricity, and so forth. Indeed, as Kuhn pointed out, many of the discoverers of energy conservation were deeply predisposed to see a single, indestructible force as the root of all natural phenomena. Obviously, Kuhn concludes that many natural philosophers in Schelling's tradition drew from their philosophy a view of physical processes very close to that which Faraday and Grove seem to have drawn from the new discoveries of the 19th century. Giles Whitley, an expert on Schelling's reception in 19th century British literature, agrees. It was more or less directly under the inspiration of Schelling that Ritter developed the field of electrochemistry, and it was through combining the discoveries of Davy and Ritter that Hans Christian Ørsted discovered the principle of electromagnetism in 1820. Johann Wilhelm Ritter was a physicist in Goethe's circle who discovered ultraviolet radiation and a rechargeable battery. Ritter's research on galvanism, however, the idea of creating life from inanimate matter by means of electricity, sparked by the observation that electric currents could induce muscle contractions in frog legs or executed criminals, finally led him astray. After he had relocated to Munich, he became increasingly obsessed with his research, neglected his family, moved into his laboratory, and died young and poor in 1810, arguably mainly as a result of his self-experimentation with electricity. As historian of science Richard Holmes has speculated, Ritter may have been the role model for Dr. Frankenstein, the title character of the novel young Mary Shelley wrote 6 years later, when she, her stepsister Claremont, and her lover and later husband, the poet Percy Shelley, spent the wet, ungenial summer of 1816 visiting the famous romanticist Lord Byron, who was both Claire's lover and stepbrother. After Byron had been forced to leave England by his increasing debt, the scandal about the split up with his wife, who had just given birth to a baby daughter, and believed her husband had gone mad, and the rumors about his incestuous affair with Claire, he was now living in a mansion near Lake Geneva. The year 1816 became known as the Year Without Summer, caused by volcanic ash from a massive eruption, the largest one for 1,300 years, of an Indonesian volcano the year before. Consequences included floods, brown snow falling throughout the year, rotten crops all over Europe, and famine, riots, and epidemics that caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. When incessant rain often confined us for days to the house, as Mary Shelley remembered, Byron proposed a competition for who could write the best horror story, and 18-year-old Mary won. Byron never returned to England, and he didn't see his daughter again. He died 7 years later after he had sailed to Greece to support the Greek War of Independence. Byron's daughter, Ada Lovelace, inherited his creativity, though, and became the world's first computer programmer in 1843 when she wrote an algorithm to be implemented in Charles Babbage's mechanical analytical engine. As this digression illustrates nicely, in the years after Schelling, Romanticism and science became closely intertwined, giving rise to an epic accurately described by Richard Holmes as Romantic Science, or An Age of Wonder, characterized by the notion of an infinite, mysterious nature waiting to be discovered or seduced into revealing all her secrets. It also was Schelling's monism that inspired the Danish physicist Hans Christian Ørsted to look for a relation between electricity and magnetism. As Ørsted realized in 1820, a compass needle could be deflected by an electric current, a discovery that eventually led to the unification of electricity and magnetism and the concept of field theory. Yet the crucial step toward modern physics, with just the right blend of proximity to and distance from Schelling's philosophy, an ideal mix between down-to-earth empiricism and lofty theory building, occurred in England. After he had returned from Germany, the poet Samuel Coleridge delivered lectures on German Romanticism and Schelling's philosophy at the Royal Institution, an organization for teaching science to lay people. Another lecturer at the Royal Institution was his close friend, second only to Wordsworth, the chemist Humphrey Davy. Davy was a nature lover and pioneer of electrochemistry who wrote pantheistic poems about how nothing is lost in nature and how all the system is divine. The first to isolate and discover several elements with electrolysis and to find out about the pain-relieving properties of laughing gas, he later became president of the Royal Society. Coleridge claimed that Davy had adopted his suggestion that all composition consisted in the balance of energies, which Coleridge himself had adopted from Schelling. Davy's greatest discovery, though, as he believed himself, was his assistant, a certain Michael Faraday, whom he first met when the young man attended his lectures at the Royal Institution. Indirectly, via Ørsted and Coleridge, Schelling thus also influenced Faraday's efforts to conversely convert magnetism into electricity, as well as Faraday's idea of describing electromagnetism as a field. The later would become a crucial step in the development of quantum mechanics and finally quantum field theory. Having learned about Faraday's breakthrough, Schelling even envisioned that chemistry would also finally be reduced to electromagnetism. Ørsted's and Faraday's discoveries marked significant steps towards the unification of electricity and magnetism in James Clerk Maxwell's theory of electrodynamics, finally evolving into Einstein's theory of relativity. Being self-taught and knowing only a little math, Faraday couldn't summarize his intuitions in mathematical equations. This was eventually achieved by Maxwell in his famous set of equations. At least equally strong was Schelling's impact on biology and the sciences of complex systems. Schelling's credo, to grasp nature in her unity, to understand nature as an organism rather than a machine, resonated deeply with researchers such as the polymath, naturalist, geographer, and explorer Alexander von Humboldt, who credited Schelling with having stimulated a revolution in science. Following Schelling, Humboldt understood nature as a net-like, intricate fabric, a paradigm that inspired him when he discovered that volcanoes have subterranean connections and shaped Earth's surface, and that plants and animals form ecosystems and affect, for example, the climate. Schelling's idea of opposing polarities also influenced Charles Darwin's theory of biological evolution, for which both Darwin and Ernst Haeckel would credit Schelling's influence. Already, Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin's 1803 poem, Temple of Nature, full of Platonic motifs and early evolutionary thinking, described how immortal love, who ere the morn of time, gave young nature to admiring light, pressed drop to drop, to atom atom bind, link sex to sex, or rivet mind to mind. Haeckel, inspired by Humboldt and Darwin to conceive of nature as one unified whole, was a researcher who explored nature from mountain peaks to the deep sea. Unsure for some time whether he should pursue a career as an artist or as a scientist, to the dismay of his parents who wanted him to become a medical doctor, he collected flowers, moss, algae, jellyfish, and in particular, single-celled microorganisms known as radiolarians, which he documented in beautiful drawings and watercolor paintings. He characterized these objects as delicate works of art and sea wonders, and they would later lend inspiration to the emergence of Art Nouveau. Haeckel also generalized Darwin's evolution to explain the origin of humanity, reasoned that there must be intermediate spaces between ape and human, and inspired his students to discover the remains of Java Man, one of the first hominids ever found. One of the most important implications of genetics, Haeckel argued, would be that both animate and inanimate phenomena are part of the same nature, entailing a unity of nature. Building on the insight that the various forms of energy can be converted into each other while the total energy remains conserved, in his book, The Riddle of the Universe, he deduced a unity of all natural forces that has become a guiding star leading our monistic philosophy through the vast labyrinth of riddles of the universe to its final resolution. Following Spinoza, Haeckel saw in the universe only a single substance that is God and nature at the same time, and encouraged scholars and artists to glorify nature or the universe as a vast, omnipotent wonder. Haeckel developed into a popular champion of monism, and in 1904, an international congregation of free thinkers in Rome announced him as a monistic anti-pope before the group marched to Giordano Bruno's monument at the Camp de' Fiori to deposit a laurel wreath. a blessing and a curse. Last few pages here. But, of course, Schelling, Hegel, Hölderlin, and Goethe didn't know about enlightenment and decoherence. They thus resorted to metaphors in order to illustrate what they meant. Nature is understood as a living organism, and evolution is understood as creativity. The universe is equated with God, and the unification of polarities is compared with love. These metaphors paint a beautiful, poetic image of nature and provide intuitive and sometimes illuminating illustrations that can inspire new ideas. But if taken too literally, they obviously lead astray. This is even more problematic if such romanticizing gets combined with the contempt of experimentation, as sometimes shines through in the writings of Goethe, Schelling, and other romanticists, a sentiment that identified experimental exploration with violence and vivisection. Thus, when Schelling's romantic natural philosophy became tremendously influential for the developing modern sciences, it meant both curse and blessing. According to Massimi, Schelling and natural philosophy in general have been accused of being too speculative, too obscure, too alien to the experimental method to ever be in position of exercising any genuine influence on the sciences of the time. The German physicist Paul Ehrmann, for example, described Schelling's philosophy as deceptions and lies, and the chemist Justus von Liebig compared it to the pestilence, the Black Death of the century. As historian of science Richard Holmes puts it, it constantly teetered on the brink of idiocy. From a modern perspective, there seems to be good reason to agree with Ehrmann and Liebig. Today, the concept of an all-encompassing unity appears as half-forgotten, esoteric, and even strangely totalitarian. When Ernst Haeckel, for example, naively applied Darwin's theory of evolution to humanity, he became a vanguard for social Darwinism and a biological racism, which later was zealously integrated into the biologistic, brutally racist, and eventually homicidal ideology of the Nazi movement. Also, the glorification of nature was eagerly hogged by Nazi ideologists. Norwegian Nobel laureate in literature Knut Hamsun's novel Pan, for example, full of pantheistic reflections on nature, got adapted as a movie by Nazi chief propagandist Joseph Goebbels, who considered Hamsun one of his favorite authors. Schelling's friend and collaborator Hegel later applied their common idea about the reconciliation of polarities to history and politics. Interpreted from a materialistic perspective by Hegel's student Karl Marx, this concept became a cornerstone of the theory of Marxism. Thus, the ideological background of the 20th century's most devastating totalitarian movements may also be associated with Schelling's philosophy. More generally, the credo of the Romanticists, who stressed the priority of the creative subject over objective facts, seems to favor a developing, fostering alternative facts in pseudoscience, from astrology to homeopathy to anti-vaccination beliefs and climate change denial. Where the one is still discussed today, it soon gets dismissed as New Age bullshit, or hijacked by esotericism. It seems not to fit into the successful paradigm of analytic philosophy. While such negative implications can't be denied, on the one hand, the backbone of such pseudoscientific and totalitarian ideologies is a view of nature as it, in the eyes of the proponents, should be, not as it actually is. Such mindsets are based on imposing a predetermined image of the one onto the world, instead of undertaking the attempt to honestly reconstruct the one out of its appearance as a dazzling array of multiple things. While for Heinrich Heine, the one was still a concept of reason, as he affirmed when he dismissed the pious, smug-hearted Jacobi as a mole, the concept seemingly discredited by its association with the horrible crimes and catastrophes initiated by the autocratic regimes of the 20th century sank into oblivion. What remained of the monistic paradigm is the embrace of nature and the quest for unification and beauty. Throughout the development of modern science, these threads have influenced this process just as much as the empirical method. It was the Renaissance philosophy of Da Vinci and Ficino that delivered the narratives and questions motivating the scientific revolution to unfold in the Age of Enlightenment. Likewise, it was the 19th century romanticism of Goethe and Coleridge and romantic science such as electrodynamics and thermodynamics that set the stage for relativity and quantum physics, the great scientific revolutions of the 20th century. Fact is, unification and the quest for mathematical beauty have become an integral part of modern physics. As Nobel Prize winner Frank Wilczek declares most emphatically in his book, A Beautiful Question, the only fitting answer to the question, does the world embody beautiful ideas, is a resounding yes. But are these notions about mathematical beauty and unification part of nature, or simply wishful thinking? Are they personal preferences projected by scientists onto their work, a simple consequence of our brain being hardwired to identify patterns and symmetries that delude us into believing in a fake reality? Do they lead us astray from what is really going on in nature? Well, not all conceptions inspired by a monistic harmony of the universe turned out to be correct, a prominent example being Kepler's music of the spheres or Newton's speculations about alchemy. Kepler and Newton would not have made their groundbreaking discoveries if they hadn't been striving for a harmonious, unified description of nature. In fact, according to history, whenever monism flourished, the arts and sciences thrived. In hindsight, this is not surprising. After all, more often than not, creativity boils down to the discovery of known connections and similarities between what hitherto have been thought of as separate realms. A mindset that adopts nature as a unity is particularly prone to find and exploit such correlations. If, on the other hand, monism eventually follows from quantum mechanics, how is it related to the search for beautiful patterns in nature? This question directs us to the problem of identifying the fundamental description of nature and how its properties get imprinted on less fundamental layers of description. As we will see, these signatures of a fundamental reality may appear as patterns and symmetries. That doesn't imply, of course, that every aesthetic ideal that has been conceived is realized in nature, but it provides a justification for searching for such patterns. The 3,000-year-old concept of monism may actually help modern physicists in their struggle to make sense out of black holes, the Higgs boson, and the early universe. So that was a few sections from The One, How an Ancient Idea Holds the Future of Physics by Heinrich Päs. Highly recommend that book. If you're still with me, thank you for sticking in there. That was a lot. So hopefully you found some value or some puzzle pieces, perhaps a few clues on your own journey to piece this thing together. I wanted to close with a much shorter excerpt from this other book that I've been reading, The New Encyclopedia of Flower Remedies by Claire G. Harvey. And if you're not familiar with flower remedies, they can be considered pseudoscience by some and powerful medicine by others. In the beginning of the book, she offers some biographical information under the History of Healing Flowers, Chapter 1, Tales of a Golden Age, Lemuria and Atlantis. Legend has it that flower essences were first used for healing some 500,000 years ago in a mythical place called Lemuria, or Mu. Located in an area now covered by the Pacific Ocean, Lemuria was reputedly a veritable Garden of Eden. The land was lush, and thanks to a near-perfect climate, all kinds of exquisite flowering plants flourished. It is said the inhabitants of this civilization were gentle, sensitive souls who truly appreciated the beauty of their environment and were content to live close to the earth. They were also aware of the natural empathy that exists between human and plant life. To them, every plant was special and had its own personality, and some believed these people were ethereal beings who could sense the energy or vibration of all living things. It has been suggested that, to them, all living things, including plants, appeared as luminous or shimmering objects. These people realized that the highest concentration of life force in a plant is found in its flowers. Just by being close to a delicate bloom, they became aware of its particular healing qualities. The Lemurians were not, however, troubled by physical disease. Indeed, it is said they lived for around 2,000 years. Instead, they used flower essences to evolve spiritually, to attain enlightenment. According to the myth, Lemuria gave way to Atlantis. Those who believe or suspect there was a civilization known as Atlantis think it probably existed between 12,000 and 150,000 years ago. Unlike the Lemurians, the Atlanteans were reputedly not content to live in harmony with nature. They wanted to dominate and manage it to their advantage. As their society became increasingly technologically advanced, stress seeped into their lives, bringing with it all kinds of new physical, emotional, and mental diseases. At this time, so the legend goes, flower essences were first used as a complete system of medicine. Much more in that book as well, but we'll leave that for another day. I do appreciate you stopping by for story time with Sean, my first read aloud. And I hope you're doing well out there, wherever it is you are, whatever it is you're working on. Thanks for stopping by. Take care.